Tirtha ji, sir has joined. Please add him as panelist.
Okay.
Have you been able to invite him in, Prabha?
Has joined now as panelist. So, good morning, sir.
Good morning. Now I'm able to listen to you. Namaskar.
Good morning. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Good
Bhushan.
morning, Professor
Good
Tirtha.
morning.
Morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. So, Prabha.
Yes. Very good morning to one and all. So here we begin with the inaugural session of the second Rupkatha conference. I hope I'm audible, Tirtha.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Dehi me saubhagya arogyam, dehi me param sukham, rupam dehi jayam dehi, jaso dehi diso dehi. I offer prayers to the all-pervasive goddess Ma Durga to bestow upon us good health and prosperity. A very good morning to one and all. I, Dr. Swayam Prabha, welcome you all to the second International Conference of Rupkatha in collaboration with the University of Arizona and Talca, Chile. Rupkatha was founded as a non-profit and non-commercial open access initiative in India in 2008 by Tirtha Prasad Mukhopadhyay as the chief editor and Tarun Tapas Mukherjee as the editor of the journal. While Professor Mukhopadhyay looked after the scholarly aspects, Professor Mukherjee took care of the digital technological aspects of the server configuration, hosting, and all in and around the logistics required, including the journal management, web design. The journal has a long history of various permutations and combinations towards innovations and standardizations, and has carved a niche for itself and placed itself in the 64th position in Asia. So as a part of this, so we are all very happy and pleased to welcome all of you to this serene conference. With this, let me introduce and welcome the president and the chief editor of the journal. To kindly preside over the meeting, Professor Mukhopadhyay is a multidisciplinary scholar, and sir, kindly take over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Swayam Prabha, for introducing us to this very, let us call it an auspicious conference. We seek the blessings of the spirits, and we start on a note of warm welcome to all the speakers here. I'm immensely grateful to Dr. Bhushan Patwardhan, President of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, to be able to be here along with us to inaugurate the session. I will invite him to formally declare the conference open in 1 or 2 minutes. And I'm honored to have Dr. Rolf Goebel, a most distinguished scholar of German and European literatures, and an example of inter-transnational scholarship for all of us here. And we look forward to his keynote address. We also are honored to have Dr. Albrecht Classen, a great German scholar and editor of the MDPI Open Access Journal on German Medieval Studies. And medieval studies forms an important component of our scholarship in humanities in India, as well as the rest of the world. Thank you, Dr. Classen, for collaborating with Rupkatha Journal. And I also thank Dr. Miguel Lopez Astorga from Chile, from the University of Talca. He is not able to be here with us at this moment. It's 1 a.m. in the morning in Talca, So he will be listening to our recorded message, and he has sent us a welcome message, and I should be able to read it later during a brief Thanksgiving moment after the inaugural events. So welcome all to the Rupkatha International Open Conference 2021, which is sponsored by the Rupkatha Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies and with intellectual collaboration with faculty of the University of Arizona, Tucson, and Universidad Talca, Chile. Rupkatha has emerged as the leading indexed journal in humanities and interdisciplinary studies in India in a course of more than 11 years of publication on themes related to literature, critical and social theory, philosophy of science, and politics. Rupkatha takes pride in representing recent literatures from both mainstream and alternative affiliations. It is becoming a home for studies on the Northeast and on issues related to Africa, Southeast Asia, Asia, and Europe as a whole. The most recent addition to its cap is the Spain and Latin America segment, which involves conference presentations in Spanish language from Spain, Mexico, and Chile. Rupkatha's contribution to academics in India is immense and is growing day by day, but its success owes itself not to Rupkatha, but to the academic community, which acts like a country of scholars who continue to weave and design the texture of thinking, the way in which we prioritize social issues, political values, and history, and therefore help keep it intact and evolving at the same time for the destiny of our future generations. The glory of Rupkatha has been the way the idea of an interdisciplinary and humane scholarship has been upheld by scholars from all over the world. In today's conference, we are proud to host Dr. Bhushan Patwardhan, Honorable President of ICSSR, distinguished scholar and critic Dr. Rolf Goebel from the University of Alabama, and Dr. Albrecht Classen, Scholar of German and Medieval Studies, as well as distinguished representatives from universities and institutes from 20 countries. We feel proud to have such scholars and authors speaking on our platform. Rupkatha shall continue to organize international conferences of this dimension with close to 100 speakers in dedicated sessions and plenary talks, participating in a virtual mode. We are a dedicated team of volunteers who are working round the clock to manage the event, talking and communicating with session chairs, speakers, and attendees. Though we have plans for a physical conference after the health contingency wanes out, virtual will be the mode of the future, and we have to expand on it and use technology to achieve this. Our resources are limited, but we could continue to build on what we have and on the human element of our endeavors. So with this brief speech, I now request Dr. Patwardhan, honorable guest for today and president of ICSSR, to declare open this conference and to say a few words of encouragement for the scholars who are attending this inaugural session. May I just say that Professor Bhushan Patwardhan was the former vice chairman of the esteemed University Grants Commission of India at New Delhi till March 2021. Currently, he is a national research professor designated by the Central Council for Research in Ayurvedic Sciences, located at Interdisciplinary School of Health Sciences, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. He is chairman, Interdisciplinary Ayush R&D Task Force on COVID-19 Ministry of Ayush, and member of several academic research and policy committees, such as the NITI Ayog, Planning Commission, Lancet Citizens Commission, National Board of Examination, United Nations, World Health Organization, Geneva, Fellow, National Academy of Sciences, and National Academy of Medical Sciences, India. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Ayurveda and Integrative Medicine, which is published on behalf of Elsevier. So I now invite Honorable Dr. Patwardhan to inaugurate the event and leave a message for us.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Tirtha Prasad Mukhopadhyay, for this opportunity. And let me first declare that the second Rupkatha International Open Conference on Recent Advances in Interdisciplinary Humanities 2021 is open. And thank you for giving me this honor to be with esteemed guests, including Professor Rolf, Professor Albrecht Classen, and Dr. Miguel Astroga from different parts of the world. So I would like to first correct that I'm no more a chairman of Indian Council of Social Science Research. I've completed my tenure. And along with UGC, I have returned back from administration of files to my students, in the university, of which I enjoy equally well. I must congratulate you, Professor Tirtha Prasad Mukhopadhyay, for the excellent work you are doing by or rather through this Rupkatha initiative. And I note that you are also, the journal which you are running is very reputed and also indexed in Web of Science, as well as it is also in the UGC list. As you know, that in India, we have very, very limited good journals which are dedicated to humanities and social sciences. And because of this, the emergence of predatory journals in India has been phenomenal during last 10 years. And while I was at UGC, I had to really look at it on priority to fix this problem and to encourage the academic and research ethics, And to some extent, we have been able to successful. But I wanted to congratulate you because you have given a better, credible option for Indian and other global researchers to publish quality research in a good journal like Rupkatha. I also thank Swayam Prabha, who is coordinating this session, and Jai Singh, professor, who was instrumental in bringing me in this. So I'm basically a science student and a learner as far as humanities and social sciences are concerned, but I firmly believe that our natural sciences or so-called technologies, are not complete unless we link with humanities and social sciences. Unfortunately, in India, Professor Rolf, I must mention that due to some reasons, the influence on STEM on our education system on so much that it practically became lopsided. And in the process, the focus or priorities or funding to humanities and social sciences was very, very limited. And therefore, in the whole education system, we did some kind of I would say, injustice to humanities and social sciences, and not only by giving them lesser funding, but even by giving them lesser importance and opportunities, and thereby contributing to shrinking the right brain of bright students, and we have taken care of this aspect in recent times, and the new education policy 2020 is giving a lot of emphasis on humanities and social sciences and encouraging liberal arts interdisciplinary education, or rather transdisciplinary education, by giving equal importance to all the knowledge systems and all the different thought processes, and this is, we hope, that help in developing well-grounded, real educated mass of students who can not only contribute to the society, but also for the global good, in addition to really shaping their own careers, which also is important. But the typical educatedness, in the education, we are trying to strengthen in the current days. So I am not going to speak much. I'm here just to appreciate this effort and congratulate the whole team of Professor Tirtha Prasad Mukhopadhyay and all others at Rupkatha, and give them my all the best. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you, Dr. Patwardhan. Those were words of great encouragement for us, and especially you, as you mentioned that that Rupkatha is trying its best to uh, be a journal, to maintain its honesty, its profile, its academic purpose, and we are doing our best, and we are indebted to a huge author pool that we now have. And the importance of humanities, as you mentioned, this is just neglected all over the world, but humanities uh, is the only way we can strengthen our human nature, our humaneness, and become better citizens in a world without frontiers. So humanities is very important. And we realize the importance of humanities when we look at different parts of the world where the structures of, culture and the structures of good consciousness are breaking apart. Thank you very much, Dr. Patwardhan, for your inaugural lecture and for declaring the conference open. So I seek your kind permission now to move on to our academic session with the keynote address of Dr. Rolf Goebel. And Dr. Goebel is distinguished emeritus professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Dr. Goebel was born in Kiel, Germany, and holds degrees from Brown University, the University of Kiel in German and English, and the University of Maryland. From 1982 to 2020, he taught German language and culture at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. He is now the distinguished emeritus at this institution. His areas of research include German modernism, literary theory, cultural studies, intermediality, sound studies, music, philosophy, and aesthetics. And he has written several articles and published books on Walter Benjamin, Friedrich Hölderlin, Franz Kafka, Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke, among others. So Dr. Goebel is also well known for his wonderful book, Constructing China, Kafka's Orientalist Discourse, which was published from Camden House in 1997. Dr. Goebel is also, very interestingly, the author of A Companion to the Works of Walter Benjamin, which was published again from Camden House, as I see, in 2009. So Walter Benjamin is an author of great relevance, interest, and I'm sure if you are referring to Walter Benjamin today in your lectures, scholars from different disciplines and scholars from literature will be interested, and we therefore look forward to a very engaging conversation with Dr. Goebel. As we had been talking about it, Dr. Goebel wanted this keynote address to be more of a conversation, and he wants to dedicate a part of the keynote session for an exchange of ideas with scholars. I think this is very interesting. This is again, this marks a departure from the conventional notion of a keynote address. And Dr. Goebel is welcome to design this keynote address in whatever way he likes. And we look forward to listening to him, listening to his lecture on music and the interdisciplinarity of music. Dr. Goebel, I would be very grateful if you could introduce the title of your talk, and if you could introduce yourself, and if you could begin the keynote address for the Rupkatha International Conference.
Thank you very much, Professor Mukhopadhyay, for this very kind introduction. I must say this is a tremendous honor to give this talk to the conference. And so I'm really looking forward to hopefully a lively discussion. And I wish everyone a wonderful conference. And again, thank you to you and your entire team, Professor Mukherjee as well, for organizing this event and for guiding us through. This is my first conference hosted in India. And so again, I'm very honored and very grateful for being able to speak to you this morning. My topic is going to be the resonance of music across cultures. And I choose this topic because I am primarily professionally a scholar of German literature, but my great non-professional love is playing the harpsichord and organ. And for a long time, those two interests sort of coexisted until I thought it would be nice to combine those two fields. And I began to focus on the representation of music and other sounds in literature and philosophy. And then it occurred to me at one point that our world is so full of conflicts and dissonances and strifes that we seem to lose touch with one another across cultures in various aspects, on a human level, on a political level, on a cultural level, and maybe even on an aesthetic level. And I became interested in a category that I would like to talk about today, which is resonance, a feeling of interrelatedness that comes spontaneously and intuitively on whatever level it is. Resonance between people, resonance between listeners and music, listeners of other speech. And it seems to me that resonance is something that we need to cultivate again in this world of disagreements, of misunderstandings, of conflicts. So again, my topic is the resonance of music across culture, and I hope it will become obvious why I'm focusing on music. And in the context of our conference, I'd like to inquire about music's special role in intercultural exchanges. What is it, I'd like to ask, that predestines music, especially European classical music, to transgress geocultural boundaries? Is it perhaps music's universality? As the German Romantic philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer has argued, pictorial art and poetry are reflections of particular ideas and thus work as faithful mirrors of reality. By contrast, instrumental music, being non-representational, Schopenhauer argues, affects the inner recesses of the human subject powerfully as an entirely general or universal language, eine ganz allgemeine Sprache, an entirely universal language, a language whose directness and clarity surpasses even the sensuously perceptible world itself, what we can see and touch. As a reflection of the endlessly striving dynamic of the universe, which Schopenhauer calls the will, music for him articulates the deepest, innermost essence of the world and the human self, opening itself to an intuitive, immediate understanding that does not require any reflection on how this understanding of music works itself. So again, Schopenhauer argues that when we listen to music, we feel immediately a resonance without necessarily understanding why we feel that resonance. We understand the music intuitively, but we don't have to reflect on what makes us understand music. Schopenhauer, I think, has provided us with the most daringly metaphysical explanation of how the sensuous, immediately comprehensible immediacy of music transcends the real world's actual suffering, deceptions, and ridiculousness, his words. The American scholar of music, Kathleen Marie Higgins, also relies on this category of immediacy when she talks about music, but within the world-immanent context of our global age of technological interconnectivity. Recordings, international travel, and the internet, she argues, have resulted in musical diasporas and transnational exchanges that call into question the very idea of distinct musical cultures. Although Higgins concedes that cross-cultural encounters can be mired in ethnocentricity and sectarianism, Higgins assumes that unlike literary texts, which often depend on verbal translation to be understood, music, whether performed live or via technological media, possesses a special kind of immediacy that, she says, neither requires nor allows for translation. And it communicates with urgency because music is so direct. Certainly Higgins is right that the understanding of music, whether instrumental compositions or any other type of music, does not rely on the type of verbal translation that textual artifacts require when read outside their original language. But I'd like to ask, does music need no cross-cultural translation at all? In contrast to Higgins, I argue that music's intuitively felt immediacy does require a mode of cross-cultural translation via what I call auditory resonance. And again, as I hinted earlier, by resonance, I understand the spontaneous experience of a sensuously, bodily affective attunement of listeners with the sonic presence of music. In our global media age, this auditory resonance produces music's immediacy across geopolitical borders as a technologically facilitated effect, an illusion that is felt absolutely real. Once heard as a technologically produced sense of sonic presence, this effect draws attention to the fact that the music's sensuous appeal is not directly understandable across cultural divides, but contains a potentiality of multiple inexhaustible meanings that require an active mode of interpretation, critique, and reappropriation in one's own cultural context. Although auditory rather than textual, this cross-cultural translations framework is by necessity verbally discursive, because as Lawrence Kramer and other representatives of musical hermeneutics have argued, verbal language is necessarily the means in which any kind of musical understanding can be articulated and preserved. If this translational resonance is successful, and there is never any guarantee that it is, music may exert its aesthetic, intellectual, and emotional power despite and against material obstacles, such as economic disparities, ethnocentrism, racial, gender, and class differences, and so forth, obstacles that mark today's global capitalist consumer society and areas of the world resisting its ideology. Even a German romantic writer like Wilhelm Heinrich Wackenroder was keenly aware of this situation. In his fantasies about art, Wackenroder provides a thoroughly metaphysical interpretation of the underlying linkage between sonic resonance and what we nowadays call cultural imperialism. For Wackenroder, music's direct identity of signifier and signified beyond the stifling abstract rationality of concepts resonates sensuously with what he calls the mysterious strings in the depth of the human heart, evoking a seemingly immediate, intuitive understanding and a myriad of free visual associations in the human imagination. In the eyes of God, Wackenroder thinks, all manifestations of musical creativity, like the other arts, are equally legitimate and pleasing as authentic expressions of diverse cultures and historical periods. Thus, Wackenroder calls for a sensibility of tolerance and understanding, even for types of music that he perceived as the, and now his words, raw war music of the wild peoples. In spite of this fairly unfortunate phrasing, which clearly reflects the colonialist ideology of his time, Wackenroder explicitly advocates for what we would nowadays call an anti-ethnocentric worldview. He criticizes those who consider their own location on the world map as the center of gravity of the whole, while their spirit, he says, lacks the wings of the imagination for flying around the entire globe in order to perceive the world in its cultural entirety. Such Eurocentric views, Wackenroder insists, presumptuously judge everything by their own standards, without considering that the cultures thus denigrated might in turn also engage in similarly arrogant judgments about European values. What I find interesting is that Wackenroder's metaphysical idealism, for all its speculative ideas and rhetorical excess, contains a self-subversive dynamic anchored in the material realities of the global politics of his day, including the rise of Western cultural hegemony and imperialism. A particular brand of musical imperialism was particularly prevalent in the European capitals of the 19th century. In his Arcades project, written 1927 to 1940, Walter Benjamin notes that together with the mechanical music offered by fashionable media of sonic reproductions of the time, composers like Félix César David wrote, Benjamin says, a type of panoramic music with enticing titles, Le Désert, The Desert, Christophe Colomb, or Herculaneum. This operatic music, Benjamin says, evokes cross-cultural resonances between the metropolitan centers of the industrial capitalist consumer society and faraway locales. As a musical reflection of Orientalist fantasies, this music primarily satisfied the Parisian bourgeois' desire for imaginary travels, while also welcoming an Arabic political delegation visiting the French capital in 1860. But these fantasies of cross-cultural exchange merely sublimate and perpetuate deep-seated Eurocentric values and colonialist enterprises that have frequently marked the metropolitan sense of global music. In our time, such critique of musical colonialism resonate with cultural paradigms like post-colonialism and the deconstructive critique of Western hegemony. Their theories have given rise to musicology's project of decentering the dominant canonicity of Western music, which is sometimes seen as silencing or marginalizing the voices of other indigenous, non-Western musical traditions. Therefore, musicologists like George Lewis envisions what he says is a continuously interrogatory network project of decolonization as part of a subversive cultural logic of the Eurological, which for Lewis differs from the self-enclosed hegemonic position of the Eurocentric by its politically progressive model of hybridity and creolization. Lewis says, a creolized contemporary music culture would be race-aware, not race-deaf, establishing a mosaic identity that recognizes historical, geographical, and cultural cross-connections, not so much to achieve diversity as to pursue a new complexity that promises far greater creative depth. My admittedly sketchy reconstruction of some voices from the Western critique of musical imperialism since Romanticism opens up a conceptual horizon in which we can appreciate contrapuntally, as it were, the counter perspective of two contemporary voices, the eminent classical conductor Seiji Ozawa and the popular writer Haruki Murakami. Both Seiji Ozawa and Haruki Murakami belong to the cultural elite of present-day Japanese, thoroughly steeped in European and American traditions, exemplifying the complex hybridity of cultural exposures, the simultaneous coexistence of classical Japanese heritage with the rampant Westernization typical of the country since the Meiji period in the late 19th century. Between November 2010 and July 2011, Murakami conducted a series of interviews with Ozawa on a wide range of musical issues, from the compositions of Beethoven, Brahms, and others, to obsessive record collecting, the relation of writing to music, and the performance style of various orchestras and conductors. At one point, they explore what makes the music of the late Romantic Austrian composer Gustav Mahler particularly universal or cosmopolitan. Murakami starts by stressing the unique montage character of Mahler's music, which juxtaposes many radically diverse and heterogeneous elements, seemingly without logical connections, such as Murakami puts it, Jewish and Bohemian music, fin de siècle, over-ripeness, philosophical propositions, Christian dogma, and Asian worldviews. This combinatory aesthetics in Mahler, as Murakami muses, may offer plenty of openings where a non-Western conductor like Ozawa can make his own special inroads. Ozawa agrees, citing as an example for this sort of universal opening the difference between the special kind of sorrow held by the Japanese and the Jewish sorrow or European sorrow that he finds in Mahler. Hence, Ozawa argues a performance of Western music that also makes full use of Japanese sensibilities, assuming the technical excellence of the performance, has its own raison d'etre. For Murakami and Ozawa, then, an understanding between the fin de siècle Jewish composer and the modern Japanese conductor is not predicated on the metaphysical notion of the time and culture transcending universality of music, but rather on an immanent resonance based on the technical characteristics of particular compositions. Precisely because Mahler's montage technique presumably does not rely on the relatively unified and close structure of the classical work of art, Mahler's music contains ruptures between disparate elements through which Eastern sensibilities can enter from their distinctly own origins of culture, sensibilities, and values. These cross-cultural resonances are not limited to classical music. For Ozawa, for example, Louis Armstrong's special and indescribable performance style resembles the traditional notion of artistic shibumi in Japan, the mature artist's attainment of austere simplicity and mastery, a key concept in Japanese aesthetics. Murakami's and Ozawa's discursive musings, even if they are rather personal and impressionistic, are part of a cultural translation process that responds to such respondent or resonant correspondences with the instruments of analytic reflection shared in an interdisciplinary context by a musician and a like-minded novelist. As Murakami stresses, Mahler's music was in a cultural sense inherently transgressive. The composer, as the writer puts it, half consciously, half unconsciously departed from what you might call orthodox German music. This might have been a reason why conductors like Herbert von Karajan, steeped as he was in the tradition from classical romantic repertoire to the Second Viennese School, seemed to project his own modernist understanding of Schoenberg and Berg onto the container of Mahler. Moreover, after Mahler's music had been silenced to the Nazi regime, Murakami continues, it fell to America and not Europe to become a powerhouse for the current Mahler revival, which began with the path-breaking conducting of the American conductor Leonard Bernstein. In this way, Mahler's music was given new life outside of the European home base, as Murakami puts it. What Murakami hints at here is the notion that cross-cultural music resonance depends on an intentional or subconscious desire for extraterritorial projection, for departing or at least suspending one's cultural origins, which in turn paves the ground for a correspondingly congenial receptivity by a very different and another culture. In his short story Carnival, recently translated into English, Murakami addresses further issues of musical resonance from the perspective of two fictional Japanese listening to Robert Schumann's piano cycle, Carnival. At a concert, the nameless narrator of the short story means F, just the initial F, who he feels is an unusually ugly but intellectually refined and attractive woman. The narrator and F develop a platonic aesthetic friendship around their shared love for German classical music, discovering that Schumann's Carnival is their absolutely favorite composition. Similar to Mahler's symphonies in Murakami's conversations with Ozawa, Schumann's piano music figures as incoherent, as a beautiful kaleidoscope that at first appears somehow beyond the bounds of human intellect. But then the two friends discover that it was precisely the eccentricity of Schumann's compositional style, its rejection of classical forms like the sonata, and its lack of a solid foundation and content that contributed to the rise of Romantic music. Almost obsessively, the friends listen to every recording of the cycle they can lay hands on. They agree that the most important thing is to indulge, as they say, in the feeling of almost aimlessly sharing something we were passionate about. Thus, the resonance between Schumann's work and its Japanese listeners is primarily based not on an intellectual analysis, as was the case with Murakami and Ozawa's conversations with Mahler, but on a deeply intuitive, sensuously enthusiastic response to the music's seemingly groundless depth of meaning. But there are others, more disturbing reasons for this type of resonance. The narrator feels that the famous pianist, that Arthur Rubinstein's playing explores the interstice between the mask and reality typical of Schumann's oeuvre. As F explains, Schumann suffered from terrible auditory hallucinations, uncontrollable tremblings, and suicidal urges. And although Carnival, being an earlier work, does not yet fully reflect these afflictions, its depiction of the Carnival festival explores the contrast between wearing a playful mask and the disturbing specters lurking inside the psyche under the deceptive surface appearance. As F remarks, all people wear such masks, and it is the narrator's fear to discover what lies beneath his friend's own surface, not her unattractive looks, that prevents him from trying to make love to her. F exudes a special kind of aura that emerges from the tension between her surface appearance and a kind of power that encroached on others' minds and hearts. Eventually, F's secret is pitilessly revealed by the newspapers. She and her husband have been arrested for a major financial investment fraud. She then totally disappears, leaving the narrator haunted by the powerful memories of the episode. The fragility of the cross-cultural resonance between a German Romantic composer and his contemporary Japanese listeners is all the more striking, given that Murakami here makes absolutely no reference to any particularly cultural framework for Schumann's reception in Japan. In contrast to the writer's conversations with Ozawa about Mahler, which at least tangentially evoked concepts of Japanese sensibility, sorrow, shibumi, the immersion of F and her friend in the music of Schumann occurs largely in a cultural vacuum, suggested only vaguely to be a metropolitan, late capitalist, postmodern space where Western music is freely accessible to individual listeners through live concerts and countless recordings. The narrator and his friend seem to live in a private non-location that allows them to cultivate an illusion of European classical music's immediacy, whose imaginary affordances of aesthetic beauty are only towards the end disrupted by the stark reality of financial corruption and legal crime. The tragedy of Murakami's Schumann aficionados is that they react to music's illusory autonomy in diametrically opposed but equally mistaken ways. while the narrator simply seeks to cultivate a kind of musical aestheticism with a woman he's otherwise incapable of loving, F, of course, is aware of the corruptibility of her own musical refinement by her financial greed that she is unwilling to admit. In this sense, F's problem is indicative of the conflict between music appreciation, which is often regarded as an ideal immersion in the sheer beauty of a composition for its own sake, and the listening subject's own morality. Ultimately, then, the initially captivating, deeply satisfying resonance between Schumann's Carnival and the two Japanese music lovers is endangered by the devastating dissonance between musical meaning and personal listening circumstances. Like Schumann's composition, whose abysmal meaningfulness can never be fully exhausted by hermeneutic analysis or countless recordings, like Schumann's compositions, F's own character, her supreme sensitivity to music hiding her moral depravity, ultimately eludes the narrator's compass of understanding, trapped as it is in his masculinist musings about F's appealingly artistic imagination inspired by her presumably ugly appearance. In this sense, the situation, which might require a more reflexive analysis than both protagonists are willing to engage in, reveals not only the possibilities, but also and especially the limitations of the musical resonance's cultural translatability under adverse personal and social circumstances. I hope to have shown that the category of cross-cultural translatability based on auditory resonance is more convincing than European music's claim to transcultural universality. Whereas the ideal of music's universality relies on a romanticized notion of metaphysical transcendence, resonance combines a bodily affective presence of tangible musical material with the need for interpretive actualization in empirical social cultural reality. In other words, in the age of media technological interconnectivity, resonance creates musical meaningfulness as something that transverses and transgresses rather than transcends geopolitical boundaries and the horizons of individual listeners. Music is never free from ideology, political power, and corruption, but neither is it necessarily complicit with these circumstances or can be totally co-opted by them. In this ambivalent context, musical resonance must be actively desired, explored, and cultivated through attentive listening. Murakami popularizes the promises, successes, and failures of such cross-cultural translatability, showing that literary fiction supplies particularly insightful strategies for elucidating the mysteries of musical resonance in ways that appeal to a broad audience beyond the expert knowledge of musicologists. In this sense, fictional representations always point to something beyond music's own sonic presence, demonstrating the power of the literary imagination to explain what music itself cannot fully say. Thank you very much.
This is astounding, to say the least. We haven't heard about music in a way in which you have been able to present it to us, to show us the way you talk about the response and reception to music, the the epistemology of music, and the human ability to sensitize, to respond to the intrinsic beauties of music, while at the same time retaining a sense of identity and individuality about oneself and one's own culture. I guess there will be questions, and Dr. Goebel is indeed very happy to take questions from the audience, and any response, it may be a question in order to know more about the philosophical issues that Dr. Goebel has raised in this lecture on music, on resonance, on Murakami, on Japanese music, and on European music, the Eurocentrism of music, of musical literature. You may wish to clarify your doubts, your understanding as well, if you are already not a music scholar. So I would invite questions and comments for Dr. Goebel's lecture. Should I start with a comment made by Adam Miller? Adam says, very interesting, informative. Adam, would you like to talk to us, to talk to Dr. Goebel here? Is Adam in the panel? Adam is one of our moderators, right?
John has a question, John also has a comment. Okay, so Adam is there and he needs to work out how to turn on my microphone. Okay. I think we can help you through that.
So Adam Miller, and then John Baker, and then Professor Classen himself has a question. So that will be the order of questions. Adam, do you want to go first, or you need time to figure out?
Why don't we move on?
Yes, let's move on, because perhaps he's not able to unmute.
Yes, John.
Yeah.
John, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, of course, but with all due respect to Dr. Classen, if it's okay, I'll defer to him and go second.
Oh. Well, that's very kind of you. So I take the privilege, and I would like to, first of all, that was wonderful. I have read your paper before, and I listened with great interest and fascination. And by the way, you almost made a musical performance. I would like to say the way how you presented, this was almost like music. Yeah, very nice and very elegant and very eloquent, and with so much erudition. I really loved it. Now, I have a couple of comments, and one thing I would like to ask, first of all, whether we might want to identify music actually as one of the many languages that we as human beings have, which immediately brings up the question, is there a universal language? And the other question is translation of that language or that music. How much translation do we need? You addressed that several times. And I have one very interesting example you might want to consider. We all know Richard Wagner as a great opera composer, but we also know that he was very anti-Semitic. And yet, I don't know the exact date, but at some point, maybe in the mid-90s, Richard Wagner's opera, or some of them, maybe, not quite sure, The Ring, was performed under protest by many people, but in Israel. And so I think you addressed also those conflicts. And I will address that as well in my talk a little bit, but this is an example I don't include in my topic. And maybe that is an interesting example you might want to use or not. I leave it at that point. So thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Albrecht. I'd like to add at this point that it was Professor Classen who very kindly nominated me to the organizing committee to give this lecture. So I thank you as a colleague and friend. To your question, which is very significant in our context, the question whether music is a language has haunted the philosophy of music for decades and centuries. And we would have to go on for about 5 days to even begin to scratch the surface. My brief answer is music is not a language in the sense of verbal languages. It works with certain characteristics of verbal languages, like small units forming syntactic, longer units, repetition, rhythm. But unlike verbal languages, music music contains this sort of immediacy, this sensuous affective immediacy, which I relate to the concept of resonance. And that does not mean that music is a universal language. For one thing, it is not a universal language because, as Benjamin and others have argued, since the fall, the biblical fall, since the Tower of Babel disaster, we have many, many verbal languages that are intertranslatable, but without translation cannot be understood mutually. Music does have an immediate appeal across cultural boundaries, but what that appeal is something that we feel intuitively and affectively, and it requires a different type of verbal interpretation, which I call translatability, translation. And so in that sense, music works like a language in the sense that it is open to real verbal interpretability, as been done by Murakami and Ozawa and others, but it is not a language in the sense of a verbal language. What it is again, it is a sensuously immediate sonority. And what that sonority means, that depends on our translation skills when we talk about music in a verbal language. And your reference to Wagner, again, this would be a huge topic. Wagner was a vicious anti-Semite, and some musicologists have argued that in certain characters, like Albrecht in The Ring, Wagner used anti-Semitic stereotypes. But the music is never totally identical with its composer's personal ideological beliefs. These ideological beliefs go, of course, into the music, leave their traces in the music, but the music is not totally complicit with it. And for that reason, that you have traces of Wagner's anti-Semitism in his operas, but the operas are not totally reducible to his anti-Semitism. For that reason, Wagner's music opens itself up to resonance beyond Wagner's 19th century anti-Semitic Germany, for example, in Israel. And when Wagner was planned to be performed by Barenboim and others in Israel, this of course created a huge uproar, but Barenboim and others prevailed. And I don't know exactly their arguments, but I would assume that his arguments were something that I just sketched, that there's always an excess, a surplus of music that preserves traces of anti-Semitism, Western colonialism, and so on and so forth, but cannot be totally reduced to it, and hence opens itself to various interpretations. For example, a Wagner critical musical performance interpretation in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem.
Thank you. Very good.
John, would you like to
Yes,
have a question? We don't have much time, though.
yes.
I think it's more of just a comment,
Yes.
Professor,
Sure.
of gratitude. Like yourself, I want to thank the professor for his wonderful interpretations. I personally had never considered it that way, and it was very, very enlightening. I also really appreciated the different, his last comment about the cultural interpretations, the way things can be so different. I see that, and I really hadn't thought of that before, and I want to thank him for this very enlightening speech. Thank you so much, Professor.
Well, thank you for your kind comments.
Excellent. We have a question from Kazakhstan. Is it possible to Kazakhstan Tatyev Yerkebulan?
Yeah, the question he has already typed, is it possible to use music as a therapy?
As a therapeutic instrument.
Therapeutic, yeah.
The therapeutic efficacy of music. Would you like to comment on that briefly, Doctor?
Yes, that's also an interesting question. It is widely debated, not so much in musicology, but in medical circles and in neuropsychological circles. My short answer is I'm not an expert on music's therapeutical purposes, but I would intuitively say yes. And why? Because the idea that music has a consoling, uplifting power, unlike, for example, any other art, that goes back to German Romanticism. The German Romantics argued that there is some power in music that lifts us temporarily out of our own personal misery and lifts us into a pure realm of sonic beauty, even of some kind of redemptive transcendence. And if we take that idea and transpose it into a medical therapeutic context, we do realize that music can have or can help us deal with trauma, psychological injury, psychological pain. Several years ago, I had a terrible personal crisis. And this is not the forum to go into what that crisis was. It was a devastating crisis. And it happened all of a sudden. And I sat here in my living room and said, okay, what happens to me now? And two things literally saved me: my scholarship and listening and playing music. Primarily scholarship, immediately scholarship, but after a while, I'm quite sure, although that is hard to reconstruct, I think it was music that contributed to me coping with that fairly devastating issue. And there are empirical experiments and empirical studies made that music can indeed have therapeutic effects. Yes.
Okay, so before we move on, I'm very inquisitive actually, Professor Goebel, because, you know, in India, we have a lot of, you know, musicality and a lot of lyricists, and we have music of Tagore and many other such reputed musicians. So I'm also not a very expert on music, and neither I have ever researched. But, you know, my inquisitiveness grows. I had, you know, as we read, there was a poetry that as east is east and west is west, never the twain shall meet, which the Rupkatha defies that, you know, there is always an integration of east and west. So can music, can music bridge the gap culturally over the cultures? That is, you know, can we ever integrate and come to a kind of a place where there could be an intercultural exchange through music?
Yes,
And
definitely. Sorry, yeah. Yeah,
no,
yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah, definitely. And this is widely and has been for quite some time discussed in ethnomusicology. Ethnomusicology is a discipline that tries to critique Western sort of colonialist and Western hegemonic notions that European classical music is sort of the touchstone of all music. Ethnomusicology tries to deconstruct that by drawing attention to the rich and sometimes much older non-Western traditions, for example, the Indian traditions of music. And ethnomusicology argues very often, as George Lewis, whom I briefly quoted, would argue, that music in our global age of interconnectivity does not necessarily mean that different music sort of coexist. You know, here we have German music and here we have Indian music, but that musicians try to fuse these musics, try to come up with hybrid genres that borrows eclectively from various musical traditions. And so this fits in with, you know, other cultural notions of cultural hybridity and in literature and social sciences and so on and so forth. So definitely the twines always meet, but not automatically. You know, again, there is nothing in music that sort of out of music's. There's nothing in music that helps music to transcend by itself. It's not music that transcends the boundaries. It is you and me. For example, when you and I are now talking, right? It is the listeners through responding to music's resonance in different cultures and then interpreting it, playing it, composing music based on, for example, Indian traditions and German romantic music or whatever it is. It is not music that transcends boundaries. Music is an art. Music is not a subject the way you and I are subjects. Only subjects, meaning you and I, people who have agency, who talk about music, who perform music, who have a dialogue about music, we, the subjects, forge these cultural hybridities and meeting points.
Thank you so much for the excellent deliberation. Actually, all of us, I think, are so inquisitive, but as we are running short of time, so Professor Mukhopadhyay will be, I think, he'll take over the next. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swayamprabha. And we have had a lot of questions, and we're running slightly behind time. We wish to hand over the microphone to Dr. Albert Classen. Dr. Classen is part of the Rupkatha family, and he has been collaborating with us for the last few years and strengthening the Rupkatha and its objectives worldwide. He is, of course, we know that he's the distinguished professor of German studies at the University of Arizona, and he has published 114 scholarly books, articles on German and European medieval early modern literature. Tracing the Trails in Medieval Literature was published from Routledge 2021. Other recent books explore the history of toleration and tolerance, 2018 to 2020. Prostitution in Medieval Literature, 2019. Topics of the Forest and of Water in Medieval Literature. Paradigm Shift in the Late Middle Ages, 2019. Dr. Classen is the editor of Medievistic and Humanities Open Access and serves on many different boards of international journals dedicated to the humanities. I now invite Dr. Classen to speak on music and its transcendence.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. So, would you please make me to a co-host? Because I will not read my paper, but I have a PowerPoint presentation, so that will allow me to show you exactly what I want to present. And while you do this, I would like to express, first of all, my thanks to you all for organizing this wonderful conference. It is a fantastic opportunity once again to work on a transcultural, transnational, and then thereby international forum. The humanities are humanities. They are not Western Europe or Asian or American, they are humanities. And so we are really in a global effort to bring people together. And I think we all can agree on the fundamental insight that the humanities are essential both for the sciences as well as medicine, but we also need to remember that we cannot always ask the scientists to accept us. We also need to accept the science in our field. So there is always to be a mutual learning process, and the transdisciplinary dimension is of great significance for the future. So let me see whether this works. And I have my PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint? Very nice.
Yes,
Good.
we can.
Thank you
Yes.
so much. And I don't have as much time as my really dear colleague Rolf Goebel, but I will try to be as concise and quick as possible. And yet at the same time, I'm afraid I have a huge amount of material I want to present. I can skip over this and that as long as I can make my central point understandable. So the talk I'm giving is addressing something I've never really worked on. And so I'm very thankful to Rolf Goebel because he initiated me to think about this. He's preparing and editing a volume on music and literature, and I'm honored to be part of that. And this is now a second exploration. So I'm looking at music as a universal bond and bridge between the physical and the divine. And I will try to inject a little bit more historical dimension, but not only, but I'm really particularly interested in what we can learn from past perspectives. So first of all, I would like to say that music is, of course, of universal relevance, as we just have heard. How we translate this is a very difficult issue. But what we can observe clearly is that music is present virtually in all cultures. You could say music is culture. So very interesting that virtually every cultural period has witnessed the performance and creation of music. And also very important that virtually every social group enjoys music there's often a difference in what various social groups enjoy, but all social groups and all age groups and all genders enjoy music. It is really, as Rolf Goebel emphasized, it is a universal issue. How it all comes together is a different question. And yet it is a very difficult issue to what extent different tastes come together. We know that generations develop very quickly, and what we in our young days enjoyed is very different from what the current young generation enjoys. But that is just the same with art or the literature and so forth. We have music from every period, and whether we're talking about classical music, medieval music, Renaissance music, Baroque music. So parallel to the entire history of the humanities, we can easily, and we must actually incorporate music as the other dimension of great significance. And just throughout these things, we can very easily, once we start approaching this issue, combine, mix, contrast Japanese, Congolese, Korean, Brazilian, German music. And I like to say, sort of in adaptation of the old adage, tell me what music you like, and I'm going to tell you who you are. In other words, music as a cultural expression of your, and my identity. What I loved so much about Rolf's talk was also that he was very parsing his talk very beautiful, and I think a very good talk, and hence music also depends to some extent on silence. So in other words, a little silence between each individual sound. The other component is, I think, that sound and harmony come together in a very significant way. So something speaks to all of us because we as human beings need some form of harmony. Also, to a large extent, but not always, word and sound come together. And I have many different expressions of music on the right side, which I skipped over a little bit, but I want to go into some more details. But more historical dimensions, I'm showing you here a very famous manuscript illustration showing us the musician, composer, singer Heinrich von Meissen, one of the famous 13th century Minnesänger. And what is important about this manuscript is that primarily, not that we have the scores, but the illustrators or the artists gave us a very good idea what kind of music instruments existed at that time in that cultural period. And you can see the high degree of sophistication. And I would say, just like with language and the arts, there is no culture that is less developed than others. You can say, even with the most simple instruments, the most sophisticated issue. The other thing is that we have really a global perspective. I start out with Hawaiian slack key music, which enjoys tremendous popularity nowadays all over the world. If you think about Bavarian marching band, might be only popular in Bavaria, but it's very popular all over the United States. Caribbean Creole music, Japanese or Arabic folk music, or very modern A-tone music by Arnold Schoenberg. So we have, of course, a universe of music with endless facets of music representing simply the enormous breadth of and scope of human culture altogether. I like to emphasize a little bit differently than in the previous talk, the dimension perhaps of music being an expression of spirituality, whether it's just the harmony or whether music allows us to heal better. Somehow it connects us with the dimension of spirituality. This is something which, oddly enough, neurosurgeons are exploring at the current moment. I've learned from some of my colleagues in neuroscience that when they use music, certain types of music, for the healing process of very sick patients or patients having come from surgery, then music has helped in a tremendous way to speed up the healing process. So music has some power which we just heard in the question and answer session, whatever it might be. We are not quite there yet to define this very clearly, but we can certainly observe this in many different cultures, and also sometimes expressed in movies. You might know this very interesting Kazakh and Chinese music of the crying camel. This is a movie that was made about nomads living in the Altai Mountains, and there is a camel that does not want to accept its baby because it was a very hard delivery. And the family, the nomad family, finally solves the issue by way of bringing in the village musician who plays on his local type of violin, and the population sings a certain song until suddenly the camel mother starts crying, and this music brings about the new bonding between mother and child, just as a perspective. And I move from here right away into more medieval dimension. Throughout the entire Middle Ages, I mean, in the West, that's what I know only really, music was often identified as a spiritual pathway toward God. And this was then very much expressed on a daily basis, particularly in monasteries. Very famous Gregorian chant, which has really an enormous spell even on us today. So anyone who is thinking about the Middle Ages almost automatically refers to Gregorian chant, which has a very unique, almost charismatic ring to it. I've shown you already one picture, and the entire culture of that world, the aristocratic culture, the courtly culture, was primarily determined by music. Everything that was not scientific and maybe medical or theological was expressed by way of music. All history, historiographical texts, poetic texts, or romances, everything was presented and performed by means of music. So in a very fascinating way, you have a whole culture, maybe 1,000 years of culture, in which music was the dominant medium to express itself. A really fascinating phenomenon. But I jump back and forth a little bit, and also would like to refer you to this very famous music, Amazing Grace. I'm missing an in there, Amazing Grace, composed by John Newton in 1772. A very interesting situation. John Newton was actually a slave trader. And so he made his money through a horrible business, trading with slaves, but he experienced a near shipwreck, and years later, then he composed the song of Amazing Grace, which moves really people all over the world until today. So very odd, as we discussed before, a personal biographical situation does not necessarily reflect what music expresses, as if music in itself takes on a life by itself and then lives throughout the ages. Here quickly a reference to a German romantic poet who expressed this very well, namely Heinrich von Kleist, with his short story, Saint Cecilia, or the Power of Music. I'm not going into the detail, but I have lots of other examples. I would like also to alert you to the negative side, to what extent music can also be abused. And I refer to Franz Liszt's very, very famous Les Préludes, composed between 1844 and 1859. I love that music, but I also know that the Nazis used this music for their military propaganda. And during the Second World War, they always played Les Préludes to announce another victory on the Eastern Front. It has a very uplifting tone to it, but it was really used by the Nazis for their propagandistic purposes. At the same time, in a very odd way, also under the Nazis, some of the most moving music was created, namely by the German composer Karl Orff, when he used the medieval Carmina Burana from the early 13th century and created his completely new types of music, which is enormously popular throughout the world, used by marching bands, commercials, movies, and so forth. I wish I had the time to play it to you, but I just leave it. And so you have, on the one hand, the political propagandistic abuse of music. On the other, however, a very esoteric, but also totally apolitical music composed by Karl Orff. And at a time when the Nazi propaganda was really moving forward very radically. From here, I take you back to the Middle Ages, and I would like to explore this issue, namely medieval music theory as universal concepts. I'm particularly interested that since late antiquity and early Middle Ages, theoreticians such as Marcianus Capella formulated in their treatises, such as here, The Wedding of Philology and maybe I could say the arts, fundamental ideas about music. He was the founder of the Western university system, and this was divided into two different study subjects. The one is trivium, namely you study first rhetoric, logic, and grammar, sort of basically language, and then you turn to the quadrivium and you study arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and then music. Music belonged to one of the most fundamental study subject matters, because arithmetic gave you the sense of numeric elements, geometry, the dimension of space. Music gave you then space and time, whereas astronomy was then the location of both music and geometry and arithmetic in the outer space. So music was associated with the cosmos, or if you will, celestial music. For medieval writers, thinkers, music was really written into the stars, and they lived in the world of harmony. So I have several long quotes. I will read them very quickly and we can discuss them further, but I want you to get a sense, just a little taste of how Marcianus argued. Harmony is able to soothe the cares of the gods, gladdening the heavens with her song and rhythms. And she desires only to make our palaces resound, detesting the ever-increasing dullness and spiritlessness of the earthborn, resulting from their lack of skill in melic verse. He might have tried to address the current smartphone generation, which only is sort of caught in its own self modalities. The other quote is, harmony bore what appeared to be a shield, right, circular over all, with many inner circles, the whole interwoven with remarkable configurations. The encompassing circles of the shield were attuned to each other, and from the circular chords there poured forth a concord of all the modes. So he describes this as spiritual, divine music, as a secret fire and inextinguishable flame, reverenced the profound ancestral song, and one by one arose in homage to extra mundane intelligence. I have more quotes. I will skip over this, but basically we could say the contrast between cosmos and chaos. So music as a segue to cosmos. The next major writer also thinking about music was Boethius. I do not need to go much more into his thinking, as detailed he is really, but he was more or less the translator of Capellanus and other maybe ancient Greek theoreticians. And he also talks very much about music as creating harmony and overcoming the diversities and opposing forces of the four elements. I leave it at that point and go on to a female writer. I have two female thinkers a name. Oops, that was a little bit too fast. There we go. Namely,
Sorry, excuse me. I'm really sorry to intervene, Professor Classen, but you can take your time. We have time left. Our next session starts at 10:45. So with the 5 minutes break, so you have time. Please need not hurry because it's absolutely very interesting. And all of us are really having a good time listening to you. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate that. That is very comforting for me. And particularly because I have this two really fascinating female thinkers whom I would like to introduce to you. The one is, I'm not quite sure whether I can move this a little bit. Yeah, maybe Herod of Landsberg, okay, who created one of the most amazing treatise on learning, which is expressed here. So basically what I've told you before about the trivium and the quadrivium is here expressed in cosmic circle. Basically you see here the three subject matters, rhetoric, dialects, and grammars up there. And then at the bottom you have music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. And so these 7 subject matters come together to create a harmonic universe or cosmos. And she projects this sort of in a way that we all can, when we study carefully, can understand and incorporate this harmony in our own lives. What you see here at the bottom are then the 4 church fathers in the Christian religion. And the other one, whom I would like to present to you, and I find this extremely important because thereby I can move away finally from the typical male-dominated Western perspective and enter at least different authorities, namely here these 2 female writers. Herod is the first one in the 11th century, and Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, who was an incredibly inspiring individual. She was kind of an abbess, not quite the same title, magistra. She ran her own community of nuns. She was a linguist, a pharmacist, a medical doctor. She was a composer of music. She was a mystic. She had numerous, enormous mystical visions, and she also created her own language. I only want to introduce her here as the composer of many different hymns. And this is what we can see here. These are later medieval manuscripts. The right is already from the 15th century with very typical scores as they did in the 15th century, whereas in the 13th century, they just had these very almost cryptic notes. But you have here 2 examples of later medieval efforts to preserve the music composed by this woman. Of course, serving for religious purposes, for the glorification of God in the Christian sense, but music served here as the gateway to spiritual enlightenment. I could also go at length into this romance, Tristan by Gottfried von Strassburg. It is a story of universal relevance. There are also even Persian versions of this. It's basically a love story. But all we need to understand here is that our protagonist, Tristan, is both a polyglot and a universalist musician. He can basically speak all languages and can play all music instruments. And the fascinating thing is that until today, we all know that if a person can play more than 2 music instruments, we are already very impressed. If somebody can play 5 or 6 or 7 music instruments, we find this unbelievable. And somebody who can play all music instruments, let's say percussion, organ, trumpet, violin, and you name it, we would not even believe it. And this Tristan is projected as someone who really commands all those skills. And so the poet plays with this and argues that ultimately, which I find really the most moving, music here becomes the medium for the love between Isolde and Tristan. So in a way, almost summarizing this, then from the medieval perspective, music serves as a language that basically connects hearts with each other. I wonder, that could be a question for Rolf later, whether we could maybe identify music as sort of the medium that bonds hearts with each other, whether there is maybe a universal rhythm, maybe connected even with our own bloodstream. And well, this is something we need to explore further and discuss. I skip over this. I skip also over this writer. He's a 16th century writer, but he also elaborates on this theme that music, singing songs, allows a young man to mellow the heart of his beloved. And because of his performance, he is then allowed to enter the court, and ultimately they both marry. And I want to wrap up very quickly with the reference to famous Ludwig van Beethoven. Of course, now I move out of the Middle Ages to the classical period and refer you to his final symphony, the 9th in D minor, opus 125, which he composed between 1822 and 1823, sorry, mistake. He drew from Friedrich Schiller's very famous Ode to Joy. So a very classical piece. You all probably are familiar with it, or you might have heard a version of the 9th Symphony. What I find fascinating, and again, this should be discussed amongst us, how come that Beethoven's 9th Symphony is being performed really all over the world, virtually by every symphony orchestra in every country, whether in Siberia or South Africa, in Peru or in Canada, in Hawaii or in Arizona, in India or in Kazakhstan. It is, I think, a universal music. And simply look at the lyrics coming from Schiller. Whoever has been lucky enough to become a friend to a friend, whoever has found a beloved wife, let him join our songs of praise. Yes, and anyone who can call one soul his own on this earth, any who cannot, let them slink away. So I would have to say much, much more, but I know that others are really much better experts than I am. These were just a sprinklings of little ideas, comments, and references to older theoretical remarks about music, and then some medieval and early modern references. I hope that I at least have touched on some of the fundamentals as expressed in philosophy, religion, and literature pertaining to music. And so I would like to say music is with us from the Middle Ages until today. So that is the vertical line. And music is with us across the world, from the Americas to India, from Africa to Siberia. So it is something that combines us. And maybe just a tiny little salute to Hawaii, sort of in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where you really find music from all over the world and enjoyed by all different musical groups and ethnic groups. So music rings from Germany to India, and music, if I may say so, is life in many different ways. Music is culture and a language, or many languages. I thank you very much for this fantastic opportunity to address this. I feel really elated, if I may say so, that I have such wonderful colleagues as you, who include me in your circles and thereby allow us to start a much more global conversation. And music, of course, is a glorious way of sharing values, joy, happiness, and love across the world. So thank you so much. And I end on this note, and I express my thanks to the organizers once again and to the colleagues here on the panel. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, Dr. Albrecht Classen, we are again thankful to you for this illuminating discussion with references to several aspects of medieval culture, medieval music, and the notion of harmony, which has so predominated the discourse of of knowledge, the discourse of mathematics, and arts and music. And this was indeed enriching for all of us. I'm sure that this entire inaugural session with Dr. Goebel's wonderful analysis of what music is, what music means for humanity, and with Dr. Classen's enriching discourse, enriching references to music, and the nature of harmony. This will stimulate an entire group of scholars here for us to begin to think about music once again and to take music more seriously, especially under the contingencies that we are experiencing today. And music, of course, Indian music is itself so rich, but Indian music is so very informed with Oriental, Turkish, and Arabic musical modes. The classical Sanskrit musical literature is almost lost. But at the same time, I'm tempted to say that the Indian philosophical reflections on music have a wonderful lot of things to offer to the discourse of musicology. And maybe scholars working in India will devote time to this aspect of music studies. But now I have 5 minutes, honestly, 3 minutes before a break, and we invite our esteemed speaker from Bhutan, the Minister of Education, award-winning scholar from Bhutan, Dr. Podel. But before that, we will have a 5 minutes break. But I can devote just 3 more minutes to questions for Dr. Classen.
Thank
Please.
you. Thank you. You can see that Seema said something about silence, and I responded that silence might be the most fascinating form of music. It's almost paradoxical.
Yes. Yes, you could reply to Seema's question, Dr. Classen.
Yeah, I just did.
On
Yes.
silence. Yes.
Yes.
Your
Right.
reflection on silence.
I think music in a silent space could really be some of the most powerful expression. I don't know whether anyone has had that experience, but or since you are enjoying playing organ, for me, sometimes in my life, entering an empty cathedral, and I was totally alone. And suddenly I noticed that an organist was preparing for the Sunday service. And I heard a few resonances of the organ pipe. And it filled the space. And I suddenly felt, it is just very subjective, but I felt suddenly elevated out of myself. And that can happen, I think, with many other situations. Let's say a little flute being played at night next to a pond, and you're the only person who hears that flute, and you know that nature is speaking to you.
Absolutely wonderful comment, and a wonderful way to conclude this session, I guess. Dr. Goebel, thank you once again. we have a demand from the Rupkatha team for both of you to come back to talk to us on music and the great traditions of German music and European music, and also to compare it to other musical modes. But Seema has a raised hand. Seema, can I give you just 1 minute, please, to talk, to make a comment before we leave for the recess?
Yes, sir. This is just to say thank you to Dr. Classen for this beautiful insight into the world of music. That music can be silence is something so visceral. When we sit under starlit skies, no word from anywhere, we experience that great music that God plays. Thank you so much, Dr. Classen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Seema. And with that, we conclude the session, and we would take a 5 minutes break and come back at 10:45 Indian Standard Time, and with session 2, and Dr. Swayam Prabha will take over from here. Thank you, and goodbye to all of you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukhopadhyay, and thank you, the panelists, Professor Goebel, Professor Classen, all the dignitaries and panelists. So it was really interesting and quite, insightful to know so much about music. A very enlightening start. So definitely, I expect enlightening end as well. So a good start always ends well. So the next session we have is with a plenary talk by Professor Thakur Podeyal as the plenary speaker, and we have Professor Chitra S as the chair. So this session as a moderator will be Seema Sinha. So I give it to Seema Sinha, and she'll be continuing for the next sessions. So thank you all. So over to Seema.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll take a 5 minutes break, Seema, and 10:45 sharp, we start with the next session. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank